Transatlantic slave trade. Before the transatlantic slave trade began in the late 16th century, West Africa was the center of rapidly growing trade, economy, education, and commodities. Many centuries before the Europeans began exporting slaves from the region, great cities like Timbuktu had become wealthy and influential in their own right. Although slavery existed in Africa prior to European influence, slaves were usually prisoners, taken during battle, or enslaved as punishment for crimes they committed. The children of slaves did not necessarily become slaves, and in many cases, it was possible for slaves to buy their freedom. Towards the middle of the 16th century, Portugal, and later France and Britain, had established vast colonies in the southern and Central Americas and the Caribbean islands. The New World, as these colonies were called, offered the opportunity for great wealth from sugar, hemp, tobacco, and cotton farming. These huge plantations meant that many laborers were needed, but there was a problem. European laborers got sick too often from tropical diseases, and Native Americans became sick from European illnesses brought over by the colonialists. It was soon discovered that African laborers were physically tougher and resisted these illnesses better. With the sudden high demand for African slaves, a triangular trade route developed. Cargo ships traveled from Europe, carrying cloth, rum, and manufactured goods, and stopped off at trade posts along the West African coast. Slaves were purchased and traded here and carried across the Atlantic to America. This part of the journey was known as the Middle Passage. In the Americas, the slaves were sold at ports and bought or traded for the tobacco, cotton, and sugar from the plantations. These were then taken back across the Atlantic to Europe, completing the triangle. These events created a whole new type of businessman in Africa, in the form of slave drivers and sellers. They raided villages and towns to capture healthy young Africans and sold them at the ports. As the demand for slave labor grew, so did the amount of slave raids. The slave raids spread further and further into Central and Northern Africa. Men and women who were captured during slave raids were tied up and marched many kilometers to the coast. Once sold, they were forced into the cargo holds of ships that were not designed to carry so many. The prisoners suffered cramped conditions, malnutrition, and many abuses by the crews of the ships. By the end of the 19th century, 12 million Africans had been sold into slavery, of which approximately 2 million had died in the ships before ever reaching the New World.
Need more help? Subscribe to our channel or dive into our expert textbooks and get that learning edge.